Many film villains are argued to be so compelling because they're the technical performing protagonist of their story. Thanos and the Joker come to mind. But one instance of this principle sticks with me that I feel goes overlooked. Biff Tannen from Back to the Future 2. Biff is undeniably the villain of the trilogy and franchise as a whole, but if the original Back to the Future is about Marty McFly and Back to the Future 3 is Doc Brown's hour, I feel it's actually fairly easy to argue that Back to the Future 2 is a story, misadventure or otherwise, about Biff. I could imagine someone bristling at a topic like this, especially under modern scrutiny. Most of the villains of the ilk I mentioned before carry themselves with a lot more poise and grandeur, whereas Biff can be described as a bully at best, and especially under a modern lens, deeply despicable. No matter how you feel about Thanos, I don't think you get anyone to sign on that Biff Tannen did nothing wrong. That said, everyone is still the hero of their own story, even if they don't have a great reason for doing so, and being a belligerent, stubborn, greedy monster is reason enough for Biff. Reflected in his relatively one-dimensional nature in the first movie, he primarily exists to push the McFlys around before getting what's coming to him courtesy of George McFly. Despite a strong performance and importance to the growth of the rest of the cast, it's hard to believe that a character as straightforward as Biff would evolve over the course of a single installment into someone I would consider one of the most nuanced and fascinating bad guys in any movie, and yet his core apish personality doesn't actually change very much. In fact, I think Biff's unscrupulous and irreverent nature is what lends him so well to his part as a villain protagonist. Because sure, we tend to think of the Shakespearean sort of tragic, sympathetic anti-hero in this principle, but arguably just as famous are the likes of Tom from Tom and Jerry, Invader Zim, Wile E. Coyote. The term villain protagonist is associated with perhaps pretentious levels of kinophile storytelling, but just as much so, I think it's a trope we're introduced to earlier on than we realize, and it's a great tool for comedy to boot. What's great about Biff is how he balances these qualities so effortlessly, though perhaps it helps that thanks to the virtues of time travel, there can be two of him at once to literally balance these characteristics, but we'll get to that. We've established that a protagonist can be the hero or villain, but what makes a hero or villain so is a little more muddy. I'm sure one could debate this from dusk till dawn, but it's widely agreed that the protagonist makes the key decisions that drive the story, and I'd argue that the inciting incident that makes Back to the Future 2 into a story is the moment in the beginning when pushover Biff witnesses the DeLorean travel through time. Had that not occurred, Doc and Marty would have had a fairly easy in-out 20-minute adventure. But like many protagonists, it's Biff who reacts to having his status quo disrupted. And even a narrow-minded ox like Biff knows a monumental opportunity when he sees one. It's this that causes the geriatric Biff to bash in a master plan involving his younger self to force every Biff in every timeline into riches and luxury beyond his wildest dreams. And it's old Biff's interactions with young Biff that really shows how much growth he's capable of. While both Biffs beget boorish belligerence and brashness, there's a clear difference between the methodical, underhanded Biff of the future and the disputatious, indiscreet Biff of the past, to the chagrin of the former, who practically detests the failings of his younger self. What's neat about this is that we don't need to follow Biff for decades and decades of storytelling to see him develop. The before and after is right before our eyes. Biff is able to reflect on his past failings whether he likes to or not. His entire arc is basically the part of Endgame where Hulk is embarrassed to look at his past self. Those aren't even the only capacities from which we get to see Biff. There's young Biff, old Biff, rich Biff, poor Biff, cyber Biff, cowboy Biff, 1 Biff, 2 Biff, red Biff, blue Biff. From this point of view, I'd argue Biff has the most development of any character in this particular installment of the trilogy. It feels very much as though Marty and Doc are carrying out a simple mission, while it's Biff who really takes the story places, and as a result we see him at every potential high and low. Speaking of which, I've also always been very drawn to the set piece of the bad future Biff creates when his plan ultimately works. Funnily, I always feel like this is the end of the second movie because of what a grand climax it postures as, when it's really much more of a bridge toward the middle of the real climax. A peer into the villain's ideal future isn't an uncommon trope, especially in a work that involves time travel, but more often than not, this signals a potential ending to the story, not a story to be continued regardless, because the antagonist winning means a definitive conclusion to the conflict, whereas Biff's endgame here almost feels more like the hero getting their dream, but realizing it's not quite the destination their journey's trajectory takes them on. Biff has his riches, but his coveted wife Lorraine detests him, and he's constantly placating the family he intruded upon. It's here he realizes his story isn't over because he has these things. Not until he follows up on his older self's instructions and kills Marty. Biff doesn't just drive the story, but his desires and viewpoints change drastically as he comes to understand the nuances of his own narrative. And just as the protagonist doesn't have to be good, the protagonist doesn't need to win either, as Biff's Achilles heel and his stubborn and bullheaded ways are lampshaded by the perfect audience surrogate to do so. Biff's self-loathing older self, as any tragic hero must as they meet their demise. In this strange way, I find it hard to describe Back to the Future 2 as a story about Doc and Marty, the way the first and third movies are. Rather, this is Biff's almost behind-the-scenes scheme and humiliating aftermath. And I think it's that rather unique point of view the movie takes on that makes this second film my personal favorite of the trilogy. With all that said, it took an exceptional actor to sell every quality and nuance of this character, which we luckily did indeed have with Tom Wilson. What really made me grow to appreciate Wilson's performance was seeing him answer questions live, in person at Denver's last Comic-Con a year ago when those were still safe. I found a recording on YouTube, and you'll just have to take my word for it that I'm in the crowd of this somewhere. Tom went into a lot of detail as to how simple Biff initially was written to be, and in hands of a lesser actor I believe he'd stay that way, but Wilson improvised a lot of Biff's self-contradictory verbiage and idiosyncrasies to make him not only seem more actively stupid, but in a distinct way, swapping generic insults in the script for phrases that very thoroughly demonstrate Biff's cruelty matched by his own stupidity, such as,
"So why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?"
It takes someone capable of intelligence and kindness to play someone exceptionally stupid and mean, and it takes someone aware of a character's failings and cautionary disposition to tell that story, and I believe Wilson was fully in control of those aspects of the character, which is why Biff is such a memorable bad guy. Beyond his trappings as a cliché bully, he's not just a villain waiting to be beaten to close the story. He's the foundation of a whole other tale, the just desserts of which taught us all to be less of a butthead.